Welcome to the Bible Feed podcast, a place for conversations about the Bible and faith in the modern world, where ordinary people come together to help each other understand the Bible better. Let's get started.
Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to the Bible Feed podcast. My name is Dan Weatherall, and today I'm really pleased to have Laurence Davenport with me. Hi, Laurence.
Hi Dan, how you doing?
Very good, thank you. Very good. It's really good to have you. We're going to start something new today on the podcast. We're going to be talking, start a series, aren't we? We're going to be talking about the Gospel of Matthew. So I'm really looking forward to that. A bit of a series that we'll do throughout the year, and you're going to help me walk through that and quiz me, and we're going to see what we can uncover.
That's right, Dan. I'll be your quiz master, and thank you for the intro. And hopefully, I'll lead the sessions, the coming sessions. So.
Cool.
Looking forward to it.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, it'd be good. I'm looking forward to getting a bit deeper. We've done a few episodes where we've sort of gone through topics at high level, that kind of thing. And it which is really useful, really helpful sort of intros, but it's helpful as well to sort of dig a bit deeper. So that's what we're hoping to do with Matthew.
Yeah, sure. And the plan is Matthew, is it? So why choose Matthew? Why have you chosen this topic?
Yeah, well, it's I suppose what we're trying to do, or what I hope we're able to do, is to discover Jesus more. That's kind of what we're doing. So obviously Matthew, one of the four Gospels, the accounts of the life of Jesus. So that's really a good place to start. So the plan is to walk through. Matthew's a big book. There's lots of things there. We're not going to cover everything, but walk through a lot of that and see what it teaches us about Jesus and introduces us about Jesus. That's really what we want to do. There's some important topics like who is he? Who is this person? Who is Jesus? What's the kingdom that he preached? He met some character called the Satan. Who's that? And there's lots of things that as we go through the Gospel of Matthew, we'll come up against, and we'll hopefully deal with those things.
Yeah, and has this study come from some previous work you've done, or is this fresh for you?
I've been looking at Matthew for some time, on and off for some years, I suppose. It's really helpful. It's possibly the first book that a lot of people engaging with the Bible will engage with. So if they turn to the Bible, they might not necessarily start in the Old Testament. They might even just have a New Testament, and it's the first book of the New Testament. So it's perhaps the first thing that people look at. It's easy to read in the sense of it's a narrative. You can read that, but there's so much going on that it's really helpful to sort of have a bit of a deep dive into it. That's what I'm hoping. Okay,
so in this study then, are we going through it page by page? Are we jumping around thematically? What should we do? Should we start at the first chapter?
Yeah, let's start at the start, and we'll see what happens in this episode and then sort of subsequent episodes as well. But start at the start. It's got a really exciting introduction, okay?
Okay.
So what I'll do is I'll just read some of it.
Yeah, okay.
So this is from the English Standard Version. Matthew chapter 1, and then reading from verse 1. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab. It's exciting, see?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm absolutely on the edge of my seat, Dan.
And that's how many verses did I get to? 4, I think. I got to verse 4. And that carries on this list of names, this family tree, to verse 16. Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. And do you think, couldn't Matthew have come up with something a bit more exciting to start off? Maybe this could have been an appendix. That's kind of what you do now, isn't it? A footnote or something.
And this is all a bridge back into the Old Testament, isn't it? Because these names here, they're not ones that you'll find them referenced, I presume, later on, but they're characters from ages ago, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right. And what I want to really get across in this sort of introductory episode is the Old Testament background to all of this.
Right.
So, and the fact that we have to try as much as we possibly can to read the Bible and read Matthew with the perspective of the audience, the first audience.
Yeah.
That's so helpful to understand what the Bible's saying, and it's so important, I think, as well. So, for example, when we read the Bible today, you tend to be, I mean, I don't know, what do you do? Sit on a settee, sit in the sofa,
yeah,
in the lounge? Yeah, maybe you're out running, or you got it listening to it, or I don't know, people in the gym or whatever. You know, it's a very sort of individualistic way of reading the Bible. It's we sort of sit down and hear it, or we read it on our own in our sort of comfortable Western living rooms and whatever. But the people that would have heard this gospel first would have been in a very different sort of time and place. That goes without saying, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it would have been people. I mean, we don't know for sure. It's called mirror reading, isn't it? Where you sort of look at the text of the New Testament, the Scripture, and then you try and work out sort of behind that what was the purpose for this. And so the purpose for this gospel, well, it was written to people who either were believers, new believers of Jesus already, or people who were interested, maybe not quite made that commitment yet, but people who were keen to know what all this Christian stuff is all about. Who is this Jesus? What's he talking about? And they would almost entirely be Jewish in their background, or people who would sort of attach themselves to the synagogues of the Jews that would have been in Palestine, or maybe a neighboring country, neighboring area in that sort of region. So we're talking about a very different time and place and culture, and people with a different background. So people who would be familiar with the Old Testament, they would be familiar with these names, these people.
Yeah.
So we're going to find as we go through Matthew, not just right in page 1 where we've got this list of names, but all through it, there's going to be references back to the Old Testament, which if we don't know the Old Testament, and I'm guessing the average person in the UK or in anywhere else in the Western world, or, other parts of the world, we generally don't know it as well as people would have.
Yeah. So you talk about this, like genealogy or family tree. That's what the first word, or a couple of the first words, isn't it? Is genealogy. Why does Matthew, this is like the beginning of the New Testament, why does it start with a list of names, like a family tree? What's important about that? Well,
it's cementing that link right back into the Old Testament straight away. Okay, so let's just have a look. Well, first verse. Okay, these picks out these really key individuals straight away. So the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So if you know your Old Testament, who's David?
David is king.
Well done.
Yeah, thank you very much. I didn't know this was going to be a quiz, Dan.
Turn the tables. And Abraham
was a patriarch.
That's so he's a father figure.
Father figure.
Absolutely. Yeah. So in fact, Abraham's kind of that first patriarch, isn't he? The first father figure of the Jewish nation. And David is the first king of the line of David, kind of obviously.
Yeah.
He's the one that starts that dynasty in the tribe of Judah that ultimately is the kings that follow him. So, two really key individuals in the Old Testament. There's narratives of God giving them, both of these individuals, promises, which, come to the end of the Old Testament, and you kind of argue that they've not really been fulfilled. They're still waiting for some kind of fulfillment. So these, two key individuals, and here we have a claim right at the start. Jesus is the son of David, and he's the son of Abraham. Okay, so immediately, your ears prick up if you're that first century Jewish synagogue goer, and you've heard a bit about this man Jesus. You're not quite sure what to make of him. And you think, oh, okay, so this is the claim. Okay, so he's son of David. That's what they're claiming. He's the son of Abraham. He's fulfilling these things in the Old Testament. So yeah, that's what I think is happening. That is making these claims straight away. And there's so much more happening here. There's a couple more things.
Do you think that's why he's establishing that link because of the Jewish audience? Do you think that's why that is, that kind of tie back to the heritage of Israel?
Yeah, well, it's an obvious statement, isn't it? But Jesus was Jewish. That's what he was. That's where he came from. That was his upbringing. That's what he did. I think it's important for us to remember that as Christians, because so often after 2,000 years of history, I think perhaps the church forgets that sometimes and preaches a Jesus who's a kind of Jesus for the individual to to just make them achieve what they can achieve in their own terms, and forgets that actually no, Jesus came. He came. The claim is in Matthew that he came to be the fulfillment of the Son of David and the Son of Abraham. So we've got to work out what that means. I've already said something about promises, but that's who he was. So there is there's to understand Jesus, we have to some extent understand the Old Testament. What is it all talking about? What's it claiming? What's it promising? So that's kind of
okay, cool. So, and as I was reading through, I actually read through this yesterday just to get a bit of context, and I noticed that there was, the majority of this is kind of a patriarchal kind of list, but then there's a couple of names which are obviously women from the Old Testament. Is that something that you've got any context or background on? I think, Rahab is a particular one that stood out for me.
So there's a few mentioned, aren't there? So first of all, verse 3, you've got Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. So Tamar's mentioned there, so that she's a woman. And then you have verse 5, Salmon, the father of Boaz by Rahab, and then Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth. And there's another one in end of verse 6, David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. So you've got a string of women mentioned, which they didn't really need to mention. There's no need to sort of draw out these women, is there? As in, the family tree isn't sort of broken by the fact, wouldn't have been broken by the fact that they're mentioned. So what's the point? Why are these mentioned? And they're really fascinating and in some respects disturbing events in the Old Testament. So, for example, Tamar from Genesis 38. Tamar is the wife of Judah's son, and she, throughout the narrative, for various reasons, ends up dressing up as a prostitute and then lying with Judah, her father-in-law, and to continue the line, to continue the seed. So, so that's a very peculiar, not straight down the line kind of set of family circumstances, is it?
Yeah, that's a study in its own right, isn't it, Dan? Maybe that's a little sidebar we can take at some point.
Absolutely. It's and the very curious and sort of eyebrow-raising situation, but at the end of it, Judah realizes that she's the one that's been more righteous than him. So, there's the kind of seemingly really sinful woman, but actually she's perhaps, the more righteous than the man. So, strange situation, but there you go. It's right there in this list of this family tree. And then, then you've got Rahab, verse 5. So Rahab is, of course, the prostitute in Jericho who is saved. So she's a Canaanite. She's not an Israelite.
This is Rahab of Jericho fame and the scarlet thread.
That's right.
From the window. Yeah.
So we're talking Joshua chapter 3 there in the Old Testament. So the spies go to her house, go to the house of a prostitute. So Israelite spies go into Jericho to try and sort of check out the wall and check out the city to see that they can take it. And they go to the prostitute's house, Rahab, and they stay there. And she saves them from the authority, the king of Jericho. But again, she's someone that's had an eyebrow raising occupation before in her life, okay, and she's right there in this narrative as well. And then you get Ruth in the same verse. So Ruth is a Moabite, so she's got a book in the Old Testament named after her. So she's not an Israelite again. She's from Moab, and she commits her life to her mother-in-law after all the male people in the family die. So after her mother-in-law, Naomi, after her husband dies, and then Ruth had married into the family, and her husband had died as well. But she returns from Moab and goes to Bethlehem and sort of commits herself to Naomi and her family. But again, with Ruth, there's a strange sort of nighttime encounter with Boaz. I don't think there's anything going on there, but it's in the narrative of Ruth in the book. There's this sort of really strange encounter where she goes and sort of lifts up the bed sheets, and where Boaz is lying and lies at his feet. Again, it's an unusual situation, and people could quite easily have raised their eyebrows and gossiped about those sorts of things. But there she is, and she's sort of commended for for a lot of things like loyalty and commitment. And she's there, and she's not an Israelite. She's a Gentile. She's a non-Israelite. Okay. And then who have we got next?
The wife of Uriah was the other man.
Yeah, that's right. So end of verse 6, David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. And it's kind of, it says it, doesn't it? The wife of Uriah. That's David shouldn't have done what he did at all, because this woman, she's called Bathsheba. We know her name, but Matthew doesn't say by Bathsheba. He's sort of very accurate, because she was at that point still the wife of Uriah, and yet David takes her. It's not the best sort of circumstance again. So it's fascinating that these people that, if, again, put yourself in the shoes of the people that would know the Old Testament, that would know these figures, these characters and these narratives, they would immediately remember these things and recall them, and sort of weave this thread together that this is interesting. These are all sort of part of the surprising stories of the line of Judah, the line of the kings, the line from Abraham. And through these almost embarrassing encounters or embarrassing stories, actually God is able to bring his purpose or further his purpose.
Yeah, it's interesting that when you read through the gospel message, you've got the groups like the Pharisees and Sadducees, and they seem very, very straight down the line, and there's no messing around, and it's all about purity and absolute kind of like the descendant line, and being circumcised on the 8th day, and all those different things are like signs of being a true Jew. And then you've got these almost blips within the genealogy which almost disturb that, and kind of would be to them a little bit annoying, a bit kind of things in the way. And I think all along, all of those things are teaching that there's something greater. There's something greater than this sort of nationalistic view of how God is acting in the world. That's what I think is happening, and it's happening here. These people, these women are Gentiles. They're of dubious background, and yet they're there, and they're part of the Jesus, who's the Christ, which is the term, the anointed or the Messiah. He's the one anointed to be the king. So this is the amazing claim that is being made just through a list of names. So I said, almost sort of joking around, that this is an exciting introduction, and if you don't know any of that, it's not at all. It's bland. It's nothing, but it probably was an exciting introduction if you know all of these things, and you can read it and see how it sort of is telling the story just through these names. That's very exciting. And then you get to the end of it, and you get the account of the birth of Jesus Christ, verse 18. Now the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way: when his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child. And again, whoa, this is dubious circumstance, isn't it? This is something you can raise your eyebrow at. Surprising. People would always think something dodgy has been going on with Mary, but Matthew set you up for that already, because all these things that have happened, God has worked with them. And here Matthew's saying she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit, and Joseph is persuaded of that. Here's something even more unusual and greater and amazing, despite it looking from the outside as being dubious and outside of the mode of what they would expect. I think that's what it's teaching. It's telling you to expect to be surprised by who Jesus is. Okay, that's very interesting. And what about, so towards the end of that genealogy, then you've then got this almost like an explanation of the structure. Did you want to mention anything about that? These 14s that occur? So you get that. That's in verse 17. So 17 says, so all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. And you think, thanks for that. I could have just added it up. That's, why point that out? And again, think, get in the shoes of the first century Jewish kind of Jesus sympathizer person, and know your Old Testament and the cultural significance of the number 7. So, it's right in the start, Genesis chapter 1, 7 or 6 plus 1 days of creation. You get cycles of 7. The 7th day is the Sabbath rest. You get cycles of 7 years and loads of things like that all throughout the very structure and the fabric of the Jewish feast days and things like that. So sevens are,
a number that sort of signifies something complete or perfect, or there's nothing magical about it. There's nothing sort of special or I don't know, weird about it.
It's not a mystical number. It's just used very often in a complete sense.
Yeah. I suppose it's a similar sort of way to we sort of were. You count down from 10 and you get to 0. 10 to us is kind of feels like it's a full number, or 100, or 1,000, and once you've reached it, you've reached a milestone. Hey, it's amazing. If you count up to 7, then you've reached a milestone. It's just that kind of thing. So okay. So what's the point about that? So you've got 3 list of 14 generations, 14 being, of course, 2 sevens. There's maths in this episode as well.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay, I'm here a week. You've got 6 cycles of 7, okay? And then the 7th cycle of 7, so the most complete cycle of 7, the very first name, very first person in that sort of generation, the very first person in that, complete package there is the Christ, is Jesus. So again, just by presenting it like this is again a claim that here's something that is complete. And actually, if you go through this genealogy and you look at it you look at the Old Testament and in the Chronicles and things like that, you'll be thinking, hold on a minute, I'm sure he's missed out a few names here.
Yeah.
And there. So it doesn't actually work. It's not. This isn't a statement of fact. This is a claim that he's making. He's using the numbers just to sort of say, and this person was significant. Because of the way I've presented it. 14, 14, 14, and then Jesus, who is called the Christ. That's what I think is happening there.
Okay, let's kind of sum up where we've got to so far. So we've managed to get through the first 17 verses of Matthew, which is pretty good for the first episode. And then we've got this genealogy, which is setting out the link back to the Old Testament and establishing that line. We're establishing the connection with David and Abraham. We are identifying some key, almost like blips within the timeline, which is references back to Gentiles or women or unusual circumstances, which all form the chronology and the genealogy of Jesus. And then even the structure of delivering this is emphasizing the completeness of it and coming to the point where we're going to be introduced to a similar, slightly odd circumstance of the Holy Spirit working on Mary and thus Jesus being born. So that's a kind of intro. Would that be a reasonable summary of where we're at so far, Dan? You've got anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that does it. That says everything we've sort of talked about. And those that would have been hearing or reading this gospel for the first time, those things would have popped straight away. And this sets them up to introduce them to Jesus and who he was. Okay,
so my other question is, there's a lot of Old Testament history here, and the Old Testament is a big old chunk of text. So the Christian today, can we just rely on like that chronology and we don't need to go back and look at the Old Testament, or do we need the Old Testament to really understand what's going on here?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And we talked a little bit about that, didn't we, at the start, about the fact that it's easy to sort of preach and teach and believe a Jesus who is kind of isolated from his heritage. And you can pick up the New Testament, you can read it, you can read about Jesus, and you can look at his teachings, read his Sermon on the Mount, which we'll get to, love one another as, and treat people as you wish them to treat you, and all those sorts of things. And yes, there's a lot of wisdom in all of that. It's great. And I certainly wouldn't say don't do that. But I think the fact that we've got, where have we got to, 17 verses into the New Testament, and every single verse is soaked and saturated in the culture and the writings of the Old Testament. I don't know how you can say that you can fully understand who Jesus was without really having some idea of what's going on, having some idea of the backstory. It's the same with any kind of piece of literature. If you're picking it up and you have no idea what the author, where he was writing, he or she, what he or she was writing about, what their kind of backstory was, then you're gonna have a rough idea of what they're saying. But if you don't know their backstory, their culture, the time period that they're writing in, if you don't try and look into that, then you might glean some wisdom. You might have some sort of nice ideas that you can sort of pick and choose and take with you, but you're not going to really fully understand and appreciate what they're saying.
Just the 4 examples that you gave of the women that appear there, you may not even realize that they are women just because of the names.
Sure, yeah.
And then okay, what's the odd circumstance around them being included?
Yeah,
you just wouldn't get that at all, would you?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And this whole Old Testament background thing keeps on coming throughout Matthew. So for example, and especially in these early couple of chapters. So we just really quickly, I'm not to sort of explain these at all, but it comes up in Matthew chapter 1 verse 22 about the birth of Jesus. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. And he's quoting there from the prophet Isaiah chapter 7, and that's in part of the Old Testament. So again, there's a direct quotation now from a passage in the Old Testament, and clearly it's on Matthew's mind when Matthew's writing this. So it makes sense, I think, to go back to that and have a look and see what that is saying, to see what's on his mind, see what the Isaiah prophecy generally is all about. Not that we're going to do that right now, but and then later on he quotes from Micah chapter 5, he quotes from Hosea, another prophet, chapter 11. There's quotation from Jeremiah. There's all these throughout that sort of demonstrate that over and over again, he's making the claim that Jesus is in some sense this fulfillment, this culmination, this climax of everything that's gone before. So it couples the New Testament to the Old, and it means that to really sort of understand both, we need the other. In some sense.
So in those statements, you get like to fulfill that which was spoken by the prophet. Yeah, it's almost like it's leading you to go back and have a look at that and saying, look, there is a link here. And the way I sometimes think about it is it's like a jigsaw puzzle, and all these little blobs are being left open, and then you put the piece in from the New Testament, and there's that fulfillment then of the thing that's been indicated by the Old Testament, that Old Testament prophecy. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. There's a few ways of looking at it. That's an interesting analogy. Sometimes it seems strange, the passages that Matthew in particular is referring back to. So, for example, one of them in Matthew chapter 2 verse 15, Jesus is taken into Egypt to escape King Herod, who's going around slaughtering all the baby boys, and then Matthew says, this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son. And that's Hosea 11 verse 1. And you look back at that, and Hosea 11 verse 1 isn't about Jesus or isn't about anything future at all in the slightest. Right. So it's almost, in some sense, there wasn't a piece of the jigsaw missing there at all. It's about Israel as a nation described as God's son, called out of Egypt. So what Matthew's doing in that instance is brilliant, because he's saying, look back at the history of Israel and how God has dealt with Israel, and now he's doing something new with this one man of Israel, this son of David, this son of Abraham, this person who kind of fulfills all these things, and the same thing is kind of happening. He's calling him out of Egypt. He's going to fulfill the things that Israel ought to have fulfilled. He's in the role of Israel, because Hosea 11 verse 1 talks about Israel called out of Egypt, but he was disobedient all the time. I tried to raise him up as a child, but he just, he's disobedient all the time. Matthew's portrayal of Jesus is the opposite. Jesus is called out of Egypt, and he does do what God says, and he does do what his father says. So this is one of those sort of contrast fulfillments almost. Yeah. There's a pattern in the Old Testament. Jesus fulfills the pattern. He sits inside that mold, but exceeds it. And, that would make people sit up in the first century. Yeah. Jewish people in the synagogue, hearing those prophecies read out, every Sabbath day, all the time. And then someone like Matthew comes along, and, the other gospel writers, they start claiming these things about this man, Jesus.
There's a few times that happens where you've basically got Jesus has being portrayed as like Israel without the mistakes.
Yeah,
And
sure.
There's that kind of
Yeah.
So there's a good example of it there.
Yeah. Okay.
So any others, or are you good for?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's got us to a good moment. Bit of an intro into the gospel. There's loads of things we're going to have to sort of unpack later on, aren't there? I briefly looked at that reference to Isaiah, didn't it, about Emmanuel, which means God with us. We've got to work out what that means. That's quite a significant phrase in Matthew's gospel. Earlier on in that chapter 1, it talks about Jesus saving his people from their sins. Got to work out what that means. But there's absolutely loads. But I think that in summary, the thing that I want this little short introduction to sort of feature or be the thing to take away from this episode is that there's so much going on behind the text in the background and the backstory, which is the Old Testament. That is the backstory, the backdrop to Jesus arriving on the scene, and Matthew's referring back to that time and time again. And if we pay attention to that a little bit, then we'll understand Jesus a little bit more. We'll discover him a little bit more, and I think that will pay dividends. That's really, really useful to do, because we get to know him a lot better, and it's well worth doing. So that's what
That's fascinating. Yeah. So Dan, how many episodes could we expect on this topic?
Let's see. I kind of put out maybe a structure of 6.
Right.
Which is nowhere near going to delve into the gospel in its entirety at all. But it
might just be series 1, might it?
Well, who knows? But it would be a decent sort of dig into sort of 6 aspects of it. But who knows? We're flexible.
Yeah.
We can do what we want. And we could carry on looking at Matthew all the time. So this alongside other episodes that we'll be doing, for the variety, I think it'd be, well, I hope it'd be useful. Hope it'd be a useful sort of resource for people as to really get to grips with the book of Matthew and discover Jesus, which is what we want.
Smashing.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, Dan, and look forward to our next episode.
Yeah. We'll do it again shortly, which is good. So thank you, and thanks everyone for listening. Really appreciate your feedback, and please just let us know what you think. Let us know if there's anything in particular in the Gospel of Matthew that you want us to look at and talk about and discuss. Then please feel free to do that. You can get in touch via our Facebook page or go to our website, biblefeed.org, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks.
Great. See you soon.
You've been listening to the Bible Feed podcast. Thanks for joining us. We're always keen to hear what you think, hear your questions or subjects you'd like us to discuss. Get in touch with us on our Facebook page or send a message from our webpage at biblefeed.org and be part of the journey.